Good morning, and good afternoon, and good evening to everybody. I am Karen McCullough, the owner and principal consultant at MMI Associates. I'm going to take a few minutes today to talk about accuracy in the BET assay. As you know, the bacterial endotoxin assay has quite a large acknowledged error, depending on who you talk to, certainly a plus or minus a twofold dilution. And for those who are analytical chemists, that's just huge. So the question is, how do we control the variability so as to increase the accuracy within that rather large window? Only my slides aren't advancing, Karen. Oh, there we go. So let's start out with the definition. So the definition of accuracy is the degree to which the result of a measurement, calculation, or specification conforms to the correct value or a standard. And our question is, what is the correct value? In the terms of gel clot, the correct value is the label claim sensitivity. The label claim sensitivity is assigned by the lysate manufacturer, and certainly here in the United States for those licensed reagents is confirmed by the Food and Drug Administration. It's a little bit trickier in a quantitative test, and we'll look at that as we go down the line, but variability in this assay certainly affects its accuracy. So what I did was I looked at the assay as a whole. I looked from the beginning to the end, and I did a HACCP test. I did a risk analysis, and I asked the question, where are the critical control points in a bacterial endotoxins assay that could affect its variability? And what I did was I found out that there were 9, at least to my determination, and if you go through this exercise, you may find more. It starts at the beginning with the control of sampling and testing accessories, goes through sample procurement, chain of custody, training of the analyst, the reagent itself, the instrumentation, the test method in terms of a quantitative test, the standard curve, and ultimately the data interpretation. So let's go through those. In terms of sampling and testing accessories, we always want to use things that we know don't interfere with the test itself. So in terms of sampling equipment, we want to depyrogenate those with a validated cycle. So if we're using glass bottles, metal scoops, those go through a validated depyrogenation cycle. If we're using plastics, we need to demonstrate that the plastics don't interfere with the test. And how do we do that? We do that using the test that we would use for medical devices. If we look back at the USP 85, the European Pharmacopoeia, the Japanese Pharmacopoeia, it tells you that all of the testing accessories must be shown to be free of interference. And again, all of that is done according to how we do medical devices. So where are those references? Those references can be found in the AMI standard, AMI ST72, or in USP Chapter 161. And while those don't address the testing of these materials specifically, the principles of those tests do apply to test accessories and sampling vessels. So how do we do that? We add amount of LEL reagent water to the material being tested. We extract that material, and then we test the extract. In this case, what we need to do is we need to look for a very low level of endotoxin. So while medical devices have an endotoxin limit of 20 EUs per device, certainly we don't want to have a limit of 20 EUs in our sample tube, so we need to assign a lower limit. We look for endotoxin in the extract. That's going to tell us if there is detectable endotoxin in or on the surface, the contact surface, and we're going to look for leachables. Leachables that could interfere with our test, in other words, materials that would prohibit us from recovering the positive product control. In terms of plastics, polystyrene is generally okay, although we have to understand that although plastics are melted and the heat of melting the plastics destroys the endotoxin, those plastics can become contaminated down the line, usually in the packaging operation. So while polystyrene is generally okay, we need to check to make sure there's no overt contamination that could have happened as a result of the packaging. Polypropylene can cause all kinds of problems. The suggestion is not to use polypropylene. The obvious difference to that, the obvious exception is the pipette tips. Those are made out of polypropylene, but the residence time liquid in those pipette tips is so small that polypropylene is not so much of an issue. There is no requirement in either the AMI standard in USP 85 or in USP 161 to spike the device and recover it. So there is no requirement at this point for you to spike your product contact surface and recover it. Okay, we know that that's going to be a problem. We know that if we put control standard endotoxin into plastics, that there's a good likelihood that we won't get it back. So there's a problem with that, so that really at this point is not required. If you get a manufacturer certificate of analysis, you should understand how they do it and you should confirm it. In other words, the manufacturer has a tube and says there's less than 0.05 EUs per milliliter in the tube. That doesn't help you out. You need to know how many EUs are in the tube, so you need to understand how many milliliters in the extract. So let's move on to sample procurement. We need to make sure that the sampling vessels are not interfering, and we need to make sure that all of the samples are procured in a method that is aseptic. In other words, we don't want to introduce contamination by the sampler. So the sampler needs to have clear, precise training on how to take the sample, and the sampler should be supervised in order to assure that that good methodology is continuing. In terms of the sample chain of custody, if we have a non-sterile sample, we want to make sure that it is transported and stored in a manner that will not support microbial proliferation. Remember, endotoxin comes from live and also dead gram-negative bacterial cells. So if we have dead cells and live cells in our preparation and we keep the preparation in a manner such that those gram-negatives can grow and proliferate, we're going to increase the amount of endotoxin in our sample and over-quantitate. So we need to validate the time and the temperature of transport and the whole time, including the storage conditions. If we look at the FDA questions and answers about this, okay, their real concern here is mixing and vortexing. Control standard endotoxin is purified lipopolysaccharide, and purified lipopolysaccharide tends to aggregate. And depending on the sample matrix, the aggregation state can either be increased or decreased. The lipopolysaccharide can stick to things. It can be wreak all kinds of havoc. So FDA wants to make sure that samples are properly mixed and vortexed prior to testing and between dilutions to make sure that the endotoxin in there is properly distributed and therefore is we can detect it. It's important for natural endotoxin in samples as well, because even though natural endotoxin has cell wall parts around it and therefore is easier to stay into solution, we do want to make sure to vortex it in order to optimize the state so that we can detect it. In terms of the analyst technique is just hugely important here. We need training in aseptic handling of samples during preparation. We need testing in serial dilutions. Serial dilutions is probably one of the greatest sources of error. We need training in pipetting. Believe it or not, even if you have a mechanical pipetter, depending on the analyst technique, we can be delivering more or less. In fact, I even saw a situation once where it depended on what side of the plate the analyst started on, the degree of error, because the analyst might be slow, the analyst might be quick, the analyst might not express as much of the liquid in the pipetter as they should. So interestingly enough, pipetting is hugely important. The analyst needs to also understand when are tests invalid and when are they out of specification. And we'll talk a little bit more about that, but then Alan will follow up with some really good information on that as well. So for my money, even though the 1987 guideline has been retired and there's no specific guidance anymore on training, I think a combination of book training, meaning the theory of LAL, what happens, why is the control standard endotoxin there, what can happen to the control standard endotoxin. So some sort of book training on theory and practical matters is important. Certainly training on the SOP is essential, and I also believe that a demonstration of competency is really important, even though the 1987 guideline is gone and that requirement doesn't exist anymore. In terms of the reagents, there is a requirement in all the pharmacopoeia to confirm the sensitivity of the reagents. And please be attentive to the manufacturer's expiration dates. Don't reinvent reagent stability. I remember giving a course where people would say, well, The reagent has expired, but it still works. Well, you know, unless you're going to revalidate and reestablish an expiration date, it really is not good practice, and it's not GMP to reinvent the expiration date, therefore use reagents beyond their expiration date. If you're going to use diluted standards and store those things, please be attentive to the storage containers. Again, borosilicate glass is sort of the gold standard for any endotoxin testing, but in terms of plastic, polystyrene is the best one. In terms of storage temperature, how are you going to store these? Are you going to store them at room temperature? Are you going to store them in the refrigerator? How long are you going to store them? So all of those conditions must be validated. Again, storage of the concentrated standard would go by whatever the lysate manufacturer recommends, but the diluted standards should have their own validation. Instruments, all of the LAL tests are temperature dependent. So any incubating device, whether it's a water bath or a heat block or even the incubating plate reader, should be mapped for heat distribution. You should know if there are cold spots, if there are warm spots. Incubating tube readers should also be checked for optics. How are the optics working? How can we check the optics? How do we assure that the data are collected and transferred correctly? How can we assure that the management of the data is correct? And how do we assure that the calculations are correct? You need to understand how the manufacturer's software works. When you look at percent CVs and averages, some of the manufacturers calculate those things off of the raw onset times, while others calculate those off of the final test results. So not that one is necessarily better than the other, but you need to understand how your software works. In terms of pipetters, mechanical pipetters, certainly they need to be on a calibration schedule. If I'm doing a 10 microliter spike and my pipetter is off by 20% or more, then right off the bat, I have a significant impact on my reported spike recovery, and I haven't done anything wrong except to use a pipetter that's perhaps not calibrated. In terms of the test method, make sure that the suitability testing, which is also called inhibition enhancement, is done per the compendia. Understand your product. There's a lot of things in products that can affect the aggregation of the endotoxin and therefore the recovery endotoxin. So the lack of spike recovery may require that you want to change the lysate vendor or the test method. While all the lysates do the same thing, they detect endotoxin, and the standard here is to detect endotoxin in water. All of the lysates are really different. They're formulated differently. They have different levels of divalent cations. They have different levels of sodium. They have different levels of buffering. So one lysate, the lysate from one manufacturer, while it does the same thing in terms of detecting endotoxin in water, in terms of formulation may not be equivalent to the lysate from another manufacturer. So if your favorite lysate manufacturer, if you're having trouble recovering your endotoxin, please think about changing the vendor or think about changing the sample. In my experience, gel clot is probably the most robust of the methods. Chromogenic can be, depending on the product, chromogenic can be a bit more robust than turbidimetric. And so you need to go through and you need to try a bunch of different methods if possible in order to determine if in fact you have a problem with your product. Keep abreast of the dosing or administration changes in the package insert. You know, the endotoxin limits are calculated off of the dosing and administration regimens. If in fact there's a change in that, it can affect the endotoxin limit, which can affect your maximum valid dilution, and your current test method may then be invalid. So what you need to do is keep up with the changes in the package insert so that you can assure that you have a valid test method. So what about standard curves? There's lots of things in standard curves that can affect accuracy, and so we'll talk about a few here. So on this slide, what I have over here is the perfect standard curve on the left. I hope you can see my little pointer. But it's this blue line on the left-hand standard curve. This vertical line here is really the y-intercept. The y is where x equals 0. And since this is a log-log plot, it's the 1 EU standard, actually, where x is equal to 0. So this is the y-intercept. And I constructed this standard curve in Excel, and you can see it's a 3-point standard curve, and it's perfect. Of course it's perfect because I did it in Excel, and I made it perfect. So what happens if I change the slope? So what I did in Excel was I kept the y-intercept the same. You can see it intersects here at the y-intercept, and I changed the slope. And I had the slope of my new curve to be perfectly linear. Note these squares, this line is perfectly linear and has a correlation coefficient of 1. So my onset time of my sample goes over here, and it's on my perfect standard curve. It tells me I have some amount of endotoxin. But if I take that onset time and I look at it against the changed standard curve, which is a perfectly valid standard curve given the compendium, because remember the compendium only says that it needs to be linear. If I look at my interpolated value off of the red standard curve, you can see I get a higher value. The onset time of the sample hasn't changed, but the standard curve has changed. And so therefore, my increase in my endotoxin, as determined by this red arrow down here, this increase in endotoxin has nothing to do with the sample, but everything to do with this change in the standard curve. So what happens here if I change the y-intercept? Here's my perfect standard curve in blue, and what I did is I made a perfectly linear standard curve, the red one, and I increased the y-intercept by 1%. Again, you can see that my onset time against my blue standard curve, the perfect one, this blue arrow tells me I have 1 endotoxin concentration. The same onset time against the red standard curve tells me I have an increased concentration. And in 1% in my calculations, that 1% change in the y-intercept can change the value, the interpolated value, by 36%. So a 1% change in the y-intercept can impact the calculated value by 36%. And again, the onset time of the sample hasn't changed. It's an artifact of the standard curve. What happens over here on this one on the right-hand side? You can see that the 3 squares aren't in alignment. In this case, the 3 squares telling me I don't have a linear standard curve, but the regression analysis drew the red line, the best fit red line, through these 3 points. Now the R value here is 0.982, which is a valid correlation coefficient according to the compendium. Okay, but again, you can see that this nonlinear standard curve changes the slope, okay, and it also changes the y-intercept. Okay, here's the y-intercept, changes the y-intercept and it changes the slope, okay, and now again, I have different calculated values, and again, it's for no reason other than an artifact of the standard curve. So the requirement here is that we manage the standard curve. Keep an eye on the onset times. If the onset times start to shift, that means your standard curve is starting to shift and you may need to make adjustments. Maybe your endotoxin, if you're storing your standards, maybe it's beyond its date. There's all kinds of reasons. It might be analyst error, all kinds of reasons. But keep an eye on the onset times, because within a certain combination of lysate lot and endotoxin lot, those onset times should be consistent. If the onset times start to shift, you've got a problem. The onset times are reflected in the slope and the y-intercept, so you can watch those as well. But the point here is in order to minimize variability and maximize accuracy, you really do need to manage the standard curves. Alan's going to talk about data interpretation and what's a valid test and what's an out-of-specification. And in quantitative tests, the compendium tells you to average the values and report the averaged value. But what happens on a quantitative test where one replicate is over the limit, one is under the limit, and the average is okay? I've had a recent experience with that, have spoken to authorities, and actually that is not okay. Even if the average is okay, if one is above and one is below, you need to do an investigation. So Alan will talk a lot about that. One of the things that we really need to do is trend invalid tests to identify adverse trends, either in manufacturing or in the laboratory. And so what I have here is, this is something that I made up. It's a series of issues that I made up for last year. And you can see there's a whole bunch of problems going from invalid spikes to hot wells. All right, so Karen, what's a hot well? A hot well is Remember, I told you that plastics are not made for LAL testing. So in a 96 well plate, there could very well be a well here and there that got contaminated with endotoxin. And those are hot wells. So if you look at here, we have a variety of problems. The lysate lot changed in the middle of our testing. We've got a number of different analysts here. We've got a different list of products that were tested, and then we have correlation coefficients. And if I'm the laboratory manager, I'm looking at this and I'm saying, oh, well, we had a few problems here or there. But if I take that same information and I start to sort it, and this is what happens when you get information, regulatory authorities are going to expect that you're going to do something with it. So if I sort it by the problem, hot wells, invalid spikes, negative controls, OOSs, and I look across, I say every hot well problem was done by Analyst CC. Does that mean that I have a problem with contamination in my plates? Well, probably not. It probably tells me that CC is having some sort of an issue and is contaminating the plates. I look at all of the invalid spikes. Most of the invalid spikes are made by Analyst BA. Now, do I believe that there's a problem here with invalid spikes? You know, probably not. There's probably a problem with BA, although if I look at invalid spikes and I go over to product, I find out that there's 3 issues with lipid emulsion. So now I'm thinking, well, maybe there is a problem with invalid spikes and lipid emulsion. Did the formulation change? Did the processing change? So what is causing this trend in my inability to recover that spike? I look at the negative controls. It looks like everybody's had their share of those. I look at the out-of-specification results, and I see that I have 3 issues with the holding tank. And so now I can go back to manufacturing and say, you know, out of all of the out-of-specification results in 2012, 3 of them were at the holding tank. And can we look to see if there was a problem there? Again, when I look at the void curves, I look at Analyst BA. Well, Analyst BA had all the void curves, and she also had the vast majority of the invalid spikes. And so the question is, do we have a problem with BA or do we have some other issue? I would maintain that the first place I would look is the analyst. So that's it. So what I want to do is sum up, and I want to just remind you that if you look at the process, okay, remember quality systems are all about processes. So if you look at the process of testing, and the process of testing is not only in the laboratory, it goes from the sample procurement all the way through to the end, to the determination of the amount of endotoxin in the sample. If you look at that as a process and start to pick out the critical control points, those are the places that you need to control the variability at those spots in order to control the accuracy of the test. So that's about it. Carrie, I think, are we waiting until the end for questions, or are we taking questions?
I had one question come through. I don't know if you'd like to answer it now or just in case.
Okay. Oh, I see it here. So
I sent it to you.
Yeah, I see the question.
From Sanjay.
Correct. How do we know that the slope or the standard is correct? Excellent question. The slope and the y-intercept are likely to change, certainly from manufacturer to manufacturer, but from lot to lot within the manufacturer. And what I've done for clients is when I get a new lot of lysate, okay, we take not just one analyst, but we take a number of analysts in the laboratory, and we have the analyst confirm the linearity, okay, and we look at the onset times across the analysts. And if the onset times across the analysts are consistent, then those become the onset times going forward that we check against. Now remember, the onset times are what determines the slope and the y-intercept. So if I look at the onset times upon qualification of the reagent across a couple of analysts and I see that they're consistent, then I know that for as long as I use that combination of reagent and endotoxin, then I can look to make sure that all of the subsequent onset times for the particular standards are consistent going forward. And so that's how you establish it. You can't go back to the lysate manufacturer. They have different instruments, they have different pipettes, they have different this, they have different that. So while you can get an idea from them of what they get in terms of onset times in their lab, that may not necessarily what you get in your lab. So I hope that answers the question.
Okay, great, Karen. I have one more question for you. Here we go. Here we are. I've just sent it to you.
Okay. Let's see. I haven't seen it.
So a question from Dawn Kalnyaz. I've put it in your chat, but it says, what might cause high percentage CV for a sample or standard?
Okay, so a high percentage CV can be an issue with pipetting. It could be an issue that maybe there is some sort of, and I assume, you know, in a plate, I'm assuming it's plates rather than tubes. In plates, there can be some level of well-to-well variability. If you were to take and fill up all of those 96 wells with a certain standard and run it through the instrument, you're going to get some level of variability anyway. So it could be pipetting error, you know, it could be an analyst error, it could be some stuff in the plates. And again, when you get the plates in, every lot of plates, you should check the plates to make sure that there are none of those inconsistencies. But generally speaking, I think it's likely to be mostly an analyst error.
Okay, great. Okay, well, I think if anybody has any more questions, we'll deal with them at the end. Is that all right, Karen?
Works for me. Thank you.
Okay, lovely. Thank you very much. And we'll move on to Alan now. Just bear with me, Alan. Okay, Alan, are you ready?
Yes, I think so.
Lovely. I can hear you.
See the screen now?
Yes, I can see your screen.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Alan Baines. I'm from Lonza Bioscience. My current role is Head of Strategic Projects, but I've actually been involved with the Bacterial Endotoxins Test since the mid-1970s. I'd like to thank Karen for a very interesting presentation on how to avoid variability in the BET assay. But of course, despite the procedures and precautions that Karen has described, it is of course possible that you may experience out-of-specification or out-of-trend results in your laboratory. So this presentation really looks at the tools that are helpful when conducting investigations into unexpected results. So the question that often faces the QC lab when something unexpected occurs is this a laboratory error or a technique error, or do we have a potential problem? Of course, in a well-controlled aseptic production process, it's not all that likely that we shouldn't get endotoxin in our product. So the majority of results will that are generated in the assay should be below the endotoxin release limit or undetectable. However, some unexpected results can and do occur with some frequency, and by the term unexpected, that can cover a number of instances. So for example, this result is out of trend, or my PPC recovery is not within the allowed limits of 50 to 200%, or my blank reaction before the lower standard, that type of thing. Of course, in the worst case, that would be that my product appears to have endotoxin content that is greater than my release limit. So how best to deal with these types of unexpected results? Well, the standard document that provides some guidance for dealing with out-of-specification or out-of-trend results is the FDA guidance for industry. There's the web address there for that document. And that provides definitions for what is classified as out-of-specification and also out-of-trend. And the OS or OOT guideline is in a PDF format you can easily download. So if we get an unexpected, an OOS or OOT result, the first thing we need to do is to undertake an initial assessment, and basically we need to establish whether or not there is a potential problem that can be attributed to laboratory or technical error, or if it's a genuine problem with endotoxin contamination at a greater level than we expect. In this latter case, it could be that the endotoxin level is simply higher than an internal action limit, or it's multiple instances of higher levels than a preset alert limit. In the worst case, of course, we are talking about a level that's actually higher than the endotoxin release limit, and I wish this would stop happening, and potentially a product failure. So let's take a look at what criteria can be used to determine if the result could be attributable to laboratory error. So this is a fairly simple flowchart that gives you a sort of guidance as to, first of all, decide if a retest is merited and what type of retest we're talking about. So the first thing we need to establish is, are the assay criteria met? A number of the parameters that Karen described, things like the correlation coefficient, y-intercept, did the blanks react below the lower standard, etc. If any of those parameters are out of specification as far as the assay criteria, then basically we're looking at the opportunity, provided we've retained the dilutions and samples, for retesting the assay, because the assay criteria, the assay itself has failed. In the second case, we may have satisfactory assay criteria, the standard curve is fine, everything is correct with the CVs and so on, but we may have a problem with the sample. We could have a single well reaction, we could have an abnormal PPC recovery, and so on. And in this case, we have a situation where the criteria for that individual sample is not met, and there's an opportunity to basically retest that sample because we don't have a valid result. So these are not what you would classify as product OOS, but essentially a problem within the assay, and they would certainly merit an investigation if this was repeated. And then the final case is if the endotoxin recovery is within or outside limits, and if it's outside the limit, then a retest, the choice on retest is determined by whether or not we are testing at the MVD. If we're testing below the MVD, which we should be if we're following the new FDA guidance document, then there's an opportunity for a retest up to the MVD, but we would certainly probably want to look into what was happening there. If it's outside that limit and it exceeds the endotoxin release limit for the product, then we're potentially looking at batch failure and a full OOS investigation. If an OOS investigation is merited, there are a number of steps that are going to have to take place. Dealing with the investigation for an endotoxin limit that actually is outside the product specification is really beyond the scope of this short presentation. So we're basically going to look at potential causes in the assay investigation. So in the case of laboratory error, is that there are a number of parameters that we can look at that could cause an error. This just gives, this slide gives some examples of that. Karen also mentioned some. Did we get contamination during the sampling? Was the test equipment normal here? Was there contamination in other tests, and so on? So there's quite a wide range of potential causes, and that can make the investigation process a little bit more difficult. So really, a logical approach to the investigation is always helpful here, because when you're looking at laboratory error, you can certainly use logic to try to narrow the field of investigation. And generally, when I'm looking at these types of issue, I like to classify them into errors that either cause variation within an individual well. So one well is in error in a pair. Those that are likely to cause multiple replicate errors, so duplicate wells are in error, or if we're investigating a situation where we're getting multiple well variations, where all or several wells on the same plate are in error. And there are various examples of this. So an individual well variation might be caused by the failure to introduce a positive product control in one of the replicates, or it could be a spot contamination that only affects one well. Those that affect multiple or duplicate wells, it could be an incorrect spike concentration, or it could be a dilution error. And those sort of things that are likely to cause multiple well variations, some examples there would be bubbles in the plate because of a blowout using a multi-channel pipette. It could be splashing from a multi-shot pipette during lysed addition if that's done a little bit too vigorously, or poor pipetting technique. So it's helpful if you take a look at the type of error, because that can narrow the number of parameters that you're going to look at when you start asking questions of the data. So we're going to take an example of an out-of-trend situation that has occurred. This is a case where the positive product control is out of trend, and the company in question makes an antibiotic, which we've called polymegacillin to just give it a name. Normally the PPC recovery percentages are consistent for this product, but the recent assays have shown a sharp upward trend with OOS and OOT results. And despite the fact we're getting these unusual PPC recoveries, the endotoxin results for the unspiked samples appear normal and are following the previous trend. So that sort of sets the background. So using some of the logic that we talked about in the previous slide, let's take a look at an example of how to use a trending database to detect the number of OOS results. So what could be the possible causes of this problem that we're seeing with the PPC recoveries? Well, it could be potentially technician error. There could be a situation where glucans are starting to contaminate the product. It could be sample contamination, change in product formulation, and so on. So one of the problems that we have with data that's generated from kinetic assays is that there is actually an awful lot of data per plate. A single multi-well plate, if it's run full, can generate up to 250 separate data points. So fairly quickly you will see that it becomes quite difficult to track that effectively, either in paper-based systems or in Excel spreadsheets. So the plan of action here to investigate this more quickly and easily is to use data analysis and trending, and in this example I'm using the trend analysis module of Lonza's WinKQCL software. So this software is designed with a structured query language database, and it provides drop-down boxes with a whole set of parameters that we can access. They're called qualifiers, and they're grouped according to the type of information that we would like to retrieve. So this little group here is dealing with parameters for the standard curve. This one is related to products, accessories, reaction times, and so on. So there's lots and lots of information in here, but despite that, it's very easy to actually access the information we want to find. So in this example, the query qualifiers that we're selecting using this process is to pick the product name, We're making the product name with an operator equal to polymethicillin, and we're simply asking for the product PPC recovery percentages. And we can actually put time limits on this, but in this example we're just running them from 0 to 35. And we can see quite easily and quickly with this plot that we've got a sharp upward trend from PPC results from assay 31 onwards. So we now need to start digging a little bit deeper into the data to try to find out what's actually happening. So with another couple of qualifiers, the first thing we want to do is take a look at the analyst ID. Is this a technique problem? Because basically it's affecting the PPC recovery. That's a function of dual replicates, so it's not likely to be any of the problems that affect a single well. So an analyst is a good place to start. So we're looking at which analysts in our laboratory are actually running this assay. And we quickly get a tabular output which shows the analysts which are running this particular assay. So there's 5 in total that are running this this product. So we now add, with the same qualifiers, we add an operator, and we say for the analysts with these names, so we could exclude anybody who's not running this assay, running assays for this product. And we quickly see that the plot produced indicates that nearly all the out-of-trend positive product control values we are seeing, and out of specification in some case, are performed by P. Jones. Now it would be very easy at this point to jump to conclusions that there's some particular problem with P. Jones. So we just need to bear in mind that there could be other factors and just dig a little bit deeper. Is it a faulty technique? Is there some material, accessory that this technician is using that is different to some of the others? So in order to do that, again, very quickly we can set these up. We simply choose these off the drop-down menus. We again pick the product name equal to our antibiotic. We pick the analyst. We want to look at all analysts, and we pick the accessory name. And here's a point where we need to use some of that logic, because if we look at the accessories in use, we see things like 30 millimeter dilution tubes, MP200, 200 microliter multipetter, and so on. And if we think about the type of problem we're experiencing, if we were seeing this as a function of the dilution tube, it's likely to have affected a whole variety of things within the assay. So it's probably less likely to be something here. Similarly, for the multipetter, if we're adding lysate with a multi-channel pipette, that's adding lysate to all of the wells. So the PPCs alone would probably not be affected. So we can home in on those accessories that are most likely to be a cause of the problem. And here we see a P20 pipetter, a 20 microliter pipetter, that's used to actually add the positive control spikes to the plate. So this is potentially an obvious candidate for us to investigate further. So by, again, picking the product in question and selecting from the drop-down menu the accessory name and making it equal to P20 pipetters, if we've been following the procedure of entering data about our accessories, we will have a lot number or ID number for this pipette, and we can see which analysts have used it. And these query qualifiers basically show us that there are 2 pipettes in use, a PIP 008 and PIP 782, and the only one that's actually being used by P. Jones is 782. He's also using 008, but he's the only technician using this pipetter. So again, it sort of points us in the direction that there's potentially a problem in this area. So in order to confirm our sort of suspicions here, again, very quickly we can set up these qualifiers. It takes a matter of seconds. In this case, we want to look at the product PPC recovery primarily, so we set this up as the first qualifier, obviously for the product in question. And we look at the pipetta, so the accessory name we set to the pipetta, and we now specify the two lot numbers. And the plot now differentiates by colour between the two pipettas and quite clearly illustrates that this pipetta is associated with these high PPC values. So within a very small number of steps, we've actually got to the root of the potential problem here, and we can just run another quick query qualifier just to sort of highlight that. So in this case, we've picked only pipetta 782, and we can see that all of these are associated with these high PPC recoveries ranging from just under 200% to over 350%. So fairly clearly, this particular pipette is the culprit and not the technique of the technician. And this type of investigation and the documentation you can produce with it does make it very easy when it comes to a potential audit, if this is spotted during an investigation, to show what steps were taken to analyze and isolate the problem and potentially to introduce steps to deal with it. So that really highlights the power of having a structured query language database to access and isolate the information we want in all of that data that's generated on a day-to-day basis. So just in conclusion, the use of this type of database trending program is extremely helpful in identifying causes of OOS or OOT results. It will allow you to set alert and action limits as well and monitor the performance of your product in relation to that. In order to be effective, this type of database should be designed to automatically collect this information, and you shouldn't really have to be transferring information into the database, because that potentially makes work for the lab, and sometimes information gets missed. So it has the potential to save both time and money for the laboratory and provide a more convincing evidence for any type of investigation. Thank you, and at that point I'd like to turn it back to Kerry to deal with any questions.
Lovely, thank you very much, Alan. If anybody has any questions, you can ask them in the question box at the bottom of your control panel. I can't see any in there at the moment.
Carrie?
Hello.
Hi, this is Karen. Can I just add to a question that was asked earlier about?
Of course, please.
Variability in the CV. Yeah, that variability in the CV. I mean, when I answered the question, I had assumed that all of the samples were mixed correctly, but if the samples are not mixed correctly, then certainly the variability in the CV, because each aliquot is a separate squirt out of the tube. If the samples are not mixed correctly or sufficiently, then that can also cause a high CV. So I just wanted to add that to the question from before.
Okay, thank you. We haven't had any questions in yet. I do have a poll question, which I'm just going to launch. Here we go. So if people would like to answer the poll question before they leave, that would be great. Does anybody else have any questions? I can't see any. No? Okay. I think then we will wrap this up. Karen and Alan, anything else to add?
Yeah, I guess, and I don't mean to speak for Alan, but I probably can. If anybody leaving here has a question, certainly the email addresses for Alan and myself have been included, and so please don't hesitate to give us drop us a line if you walk away and are at all confused, because the idea here is to make sure that everybody's questions are answered. So.
Lovely, thank you.
Yes, yes, I certainly concur with that. I'll be very happy to receive any questions, and I'd like to apologise for my computer insisting on trying to change the colour scheme. I shall remonstrate with it after the
Thanks, Alan. It wasn't too much of a disturbance, I don't think.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks everybody.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.